Okay, welcome back. So this video is a follow-up to the previous video about normal distributions. Time to get informal about normal. That is lame, and I apologize, but um, nonetheless, like I said, wanted to address some issues with the word normal and sort of everything that's tied into it in social science and psychology. And so let's briefly rehash the first couple slides from our last video. So what does the word normal mean? Well, this is something we use in everyday conversation, right? Talking about the weather. Um, yeah, if food doesn't taste normal, we might check the expiration date. If the teacher's looking or some authority figure, we might nudge our friends and tell them to act normal so we don't get in trouble. We talk about things being normal, like, it was pretty normal Tuesday, pretty normal weekend. And in social science, we use this similarly, right? Describing what is typical or most frequent, like this quote that uh, comes from a study about birth weight corresponding with psychological difficulties later in life, comparing low birth weight babies to normal birth weight babies. In other words, what is most typical for birth weight. And we also talked about how real world data often approximate a normal distribution, right? And so this GIF was one example of that, right? Showing that real world data are often a little bit messier, but in the aggregate, they approximate this normal distribution. And so overall, what we're getting at here is the fact that normal in social science means typical or most frequent. And this is something that's been used in psychology for a long time. Like, a lot of classes today are still called abnormal psychology. And there is some pushback against this word, though, and the question then is why. And generally speaking, I think for one, something I don't even like get into later is the fact that um, normal has or abnormal. These terms have sort of shifted in their acceptability just as a result of general cultural trends with language. A lot of insults, like if you're insulting someone's intelligence, you might call them like a moron or an imbecile or an idiot. Those are words that actually used to be used legitimately in psychology decades ago. And so this is kind of this strange pattern of words that originally are developed or used as general terminology in like medicine or science. Eventually, they start to get used enough that those words get abused and used as insults, and then they become unacceptable in general norms. So that's one reason. Um, and so this book here is an example of kind of pushing back to this idea of the myth of normal. But this is pushing back less in the sense of the word being insulting and more in the sense of the fact that, yeah, defining something as normal is actually really hard to do. And so let me walk through some issues that hopefully get at the point I'm trying to make here. So first, one issue is that just because something is normal or most common or most frequent does not mean that it is moral, right? Normal does not mean right as much as or as close as we can get to defining anything as morally right, because that is subjective, and I'm sure some people would argue with me if I said something's morally right. Um, but some that I imagine most of us can agree on, I hope. Some things that have been considered normal in human societies that are not moral. Slavery, first off, that's a big one. Genocide, also a big one, right? Trying to eliminate a race or culture or ethnic group or whatever it may be. Or in the case of slavery, treating them as property. All sorts of isms, so supremacy, inequality, racism, colorism, classism, sexism, right? These are all things that have been normal in human societies. Yeah, and some of which are still certainly present today. I don't know that I'd say they're normal everywhere, but they certainly are still present. And in some societies, I think the case can be made that these things are definitely considered normal. Um, putting, yeah, if we consider people abnormal or different or less than, putting these people in prisons or mental institutions against their will, right? And we could keep going here, but point is, again, normal does not mean moral, right? Things that have been accepted in human societies, cultures, civilizations, communities, um, are not necessarily things that I imagine most would consider moral. Another issue is that normal does not mean stable and unchanging, and this is a frustrating part of it. In that, like, if you open up the DSM, um, what's used to diagnose people in psychiatry, if you open up the DSM and look at a bunch of symptoms, you're probably going to see some of it yourself in many things, right? That's because these are all facets of human behavior. Um, the issue is more of when it becomes an extreme problem that persists over time, right? But that doesn't mean that we won't have any of that. Like, I guess to back up here, so life is hard and we're not robots, right? Like, um, things happen, right? There are high highs in life. There are beautiful aspects of life. There's love, creativity, nature, all these wonderful things. Um, and we feel those, but we also feel other things too, which have often been pathologized in psychology. So it's normal to have feelings, right? I don't know if you need that reassurance, but let me reassure you that it is normal to have feelings. Um, it's normal for emotional states to change, right? And combining the two of those, right? It's normal to feel good if you feel like you're doing well and you're succeeding and you're thriving and you're accomplishing your goals and you have healthy relationships. And then if some tragedy happens, it's normal to grieve that, to feel anxious, to feel depressed, right? Like when life throws things our way, it's normal for our emotional state to respond accordingly and to feel that, um, right? And in the aggregate, it's normal for stress to wear in our bodies and minds, right? It's normal for stress to accumulate. And little stresses can add up over time if we haven't had time to recover in some capacity. And really big stresses where trauma can have a much more pronounced impact on our bodies and minds. That again can throw our system off and alter our homeostasis if we don't have a chance to recover. And so again, this point here is that normal does not mean stable and unchanging. And I think if we work backwards, so if we started, like I said, like start at the DSM, look at all these symptoms and work backwards. So, okay, what is normal? I feel like for me at least, my intuition is like, okay, it basically says that we just have to be these stable robots that don't have feelings. Um, but again, like it's normal to have these experiences, but when issues, yeah, I shouldn't say these because some of these are positive, but when issues are persistently affecting our lives and relationships, it's probably time for us for help, right? Because that's a key criteria in labeling something a disorder in psychiatry and psychology, right? If we're chronically anxious, for example, and it's affecting our ability to live and thrive, then we should probably seek some help, right? So I want to start throwing that disclaimer. Building from that, normal does not mean what we see most often. If we consider normal just through our own pair of eyeballs, then we're in trouble because this is very, very likely a fallacy of ethnocentrism, right? And ethnocentrism, or if something is ethnocentric, it's essentially a belief that one's own ethnic group or culture is at the center of everything, right? We're failing to see beyond our own line of sight. And most often, we tend to view our group or our ethnic group or culture as superior to others, and then all other groups, cultures, norms, whatever, are scaled and rated in reference to our own culture, right? So a link you can click in the slides if you want to read more about this, right? And so some examples of ethnocentric, um, yeah, things that are manifested ethnocentrically. One example is animacy in languages. If you're not familiar with animacy, there's a good article I'd encourage you to read about this. And the way I define it, it's a feature of languages that express how animate or alive things are. And so in the English language, we meaning English language speakers, we tend to refer to people with pronouns, but refer to natural beings as it, right? So in other words, if I'm talking to my friend, I might say, or I'm talking about my friend, I guess I might say he, she, they, whatever. But if I'm talking about, I don't know, like a frog that I see jumping down the street, I might say it, right? And that's something that varies, and that's actually, yeah, some have argued that that's a key piece, or sort of oh gosh, I'm blanking on the right way to describe this. That's sort of a manifestation or a peek at something that is a more implicit bias within English language speakers or the culture from which English language has evolved and developed over time. And that is one that places us above or superior to other natural beings, like Like in this case, we have man up at the top, women beneath them, and then all these other animals and plants beneath them, right? More of an eco-based, or I'm sorry, an ego-based approach to living and perceiving the world. Whereas a more eco-based one, use it more as a circle, less hierarchical, more heterarchical, um, and generally like in many languages, people, native language speakers will refer to natural beings as, um, or using pronouns just like we would in English. Wow, stumbled through that one. And so a quote from that article, that again, I recommend that you view. Um, yeah, there's the link if you can see that. Because we speak and live with this language every day, referring to English, our minds have also been colonized by this notion that the non-human living world and the world of inanimate objects have equal status. Bulldozers, buttons, berries, and butterflies are all referred to as it, as things, whether they are inanimate industrial products or living beings. Right? So again, just referring to this fact that by speaking this way all the time, in some ways, we've kind of trained our mind to view anything besides a human as less than. Sometimes even other humans we view as less than us, right? And that's a problem. Other examples of ethnocentric um, characteristics of our society, modern maps and borders, right? These are things that have been defined um, oftentimes by dominant groups or colonizers that have prevailed to this day, but certainly are subject to historical development and colonization and yeah, and oppression and power imbalances, right? And all these other factors that went into creating the map as we see it today. And so just like if this isn't landing, just ask yourself, okay, well, what if our directions were reversed? Like this is a map that is upside down and flipped. And it looks weird, right? Like, yeah, like recording this in Fairbanks, Alaska, okay, we'd be here. And the world just looks completely different. United States over here. So this would be like, for example, if yeah, you can look at this Wikipedia page for early world maps if you want to have some fun and like look more into this history. Um, but this was all like stemming from our early notions of directions, right? And how we labeled them and how we decided to chart those, right? With north being up, south being down, west being left, and east being right. And we could have easily done the opposite, right? Like, or I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have been that easy to do. Maybe it was more intuitive than I'm making it out to be. But it's still a thought, right? This is still a product of our human development and how we put maps together. And this is still using the modern borders. It's one example of something that isn't. This is coming from this native land website, and it shows the historical traditional territories of various indigenous groups throughout the North American continent, right? And so you can see here, yeah, like lots of colors overlapping that aren't even labeled here. But I really encourage you to check out this website and look at it. And just, yeah, I think it's an interesting reflection of the fact that the borders we see on maps today aren't necessarily reflective almost across the board of historical indigenous peoples um, and their sort of natural boundaries or borders of their time or of previous times, I should say. And these don't necessarily map onto current reservations or tribal boundaries or anything like that. But there are other maps you can do to this website too. I think you can do one for language, right? So language speaking regions. Um, but again, something to check out and just going to show that modern borders do not necessarily reflect the full history of the places that they aim to reflect or represent. And even thinking about hemispheres on our map, right? Like we have like east and west, north and south. Some people have made the case that there could be just a land hemisphere and a water hemisphere. And it is nuts when you look at this world map and you realize, okay, like there's so much of it that is water, so much of this hemisphere, in this case, the water hemisphere. Um, and yeah, you can check out the Wikipedia page to see where the dividing line is because it's not like right down the middle. Um, it's more of like a slant. But yeah, just other ways of looking at our world that go beyond our predominantly ethnocentric way of viewing things, or our way of viewing things that has evolved through ethnocentric means. Um, Hopefully, you're still with me. Some other normal issues. I'll speed up here. Pop culture often misinterprets normal distributions, especially in psychology. So, for example, the gender binary, the idea that there are two genders and no more, and that there are stark contrasts or differences between those genders. When you look at aggregate data, that really doesn't hold up. So, this is a visual depiction of two distributions that differ of an effect size of 0.21. That little arrow represents the effect size. These lines represents the mean of these two distributions. And so you can see most of these distributions overlap. And the reason that I'm showing this image is because this comes from a metasynthesis article. If you're familiar with meta-analysis, a metasynthesis is essentially like a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. So it's as good as we can get at looking at all the research that's been done, what sort of conclusions we can draw from them. And the overall effect of looking at differences between genders, if we're adopting the binary, we see this, right? This is what the distributions look like. And that's not to say that there aren't some more pronounced differences, but they're very specific. Like, what was an example? Like, I think abstract rotation, like if I ask you to like imagine a moose and then like rotate that image of the moose in your head, that is something that there can be some gender difference on. With a larger effect than this. But overwhelmingly, most of the effects, when we're looking at these individual differences between genders, most of the effects are very small or small, right? And so this is just one example of the fact that we talk about gender differences. And I think this narrative is changing, but we talk about these things without really failing to consider, okay, what does the data actually look like? Another example is the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Um, you might have taken this, it might be ringing a bell. If not, maybe this will ring a bell. Um, and if you're not familiar with it or need a refresher, this is a self-proclaimed personality test that can identify your type, such as an INTJ, right? And so there are these 16 different types, 4 different letters that each represent, one of 2 possibilities. So you can be like an I or an E, an S or an N, an F or a T, a P, or a J, right? So there's 16 combinations of those 4 letters. And basically, by nature of the MBTI, so for example, the I and the E, I and E, that represents you're an introvert or you're an extrovert, right? And so essentially what that distribution should look like is this, right? If the MBTI is valid, right, and if we have these different types, these buckets that we can place ourselves in as a result of this test, then for each of those 4 dimensions, it's saying that this is what it should look like. So if you imagine this is the scale of introversion and extroversion, the lowest possible score should be over here, highest possible score is over here. The scale midpoint should be right here. And here's the scale if it helps, right? So we can see if this was like a 1 to 7, 1 means you're super introverted, 7 means you're super extroverted, right? We should see this bimodal distribution where we have a lot of people who are extroverts and a lot of people who are introverts and not really in between, right? And that's not what we see. That's not what we see for any personality traits in humanity, right? What we almost always will come to when we get enough data is a normal distribution, right? And so what the MBTI and these other type-based personality tests and any sort of thing where we're trying to like categorize people in psychology when we're measuring something that's actually on a normal distribution, what we're doing is forcing this arbitrary distinction right down the middle. And so we're saying if you fall on the left of this mean line here, you're an I. If you fall on the right, you are an E, you're an extrovert. And so the issue then is that 2 people, like say you scored here and your buddy scored here, it's going to say that you're an I, you're an E. But practically speaking, on that scale, you're very, very, very similar, right? And in fact, I've taken this test before, and my I and E will change depending on my day, right? Depending on my mood, if I'm feeling social or not that day, because I'm like right in the middle, right? And so it's just going to push me over the edge a little bit one way or another. And so it's saying that these are 2 different people. And okay, that might not seem too egregious, but it's also saying that this person and this person are both I's, right? There's no difference between the two based off how they're categorized with this letter, right? We're just saying they're both I's, they're both introverts, even though this person is like proportionally very, very, very introverted, more introverted than like 98% of the population. And this person is also an introvert, even though they're more introverted than like 52% of the population, right? And so again, it's just this arbitrary distinction. And so same thing on this side, right? We're saying that these people are I's, these people are E's, even though these two are very, very identical. And this person is extremely introverted, this person is extremely extroverted, right? And so that's the issue with these arbitrary distinctions that the MBTI and other type theories are making. And so if you look at how they can play out on a grand scale, if we just look at just the INTP, right, just the left side of these distributions, a person who scores right to the left of the mean on all of these is going to be categorized in INTP. And a person who scores all the way down here is going to be an INTP, right? Saying that those are the same people. And they're just not, right? This person is extremely introverted, extremely intuitive, extremely perceptive, and extremely thoughtful. This person is, kind of in the middle, but depending on my day, I might like test a little bit higher on the side, right? And so, this is another example of how a lot of fads and pop psychology fails to consider normal distributions in the very conceptual theoretical basis for the premise or the idea that we're trying to spread, like the idea of personality types. Um, okay, and so one last issue here. This has become longer than I expected. The norm is dependent on the sample population and time of any given study, right? So again, our sampling is going to have a huge effect on what sort of data we collect and what sort of inferences we can draw from it. The populations we're considering, like psychology 100 years ago, was not considering a very diverse population when it comes to global humanity. And it's also dependent on the time, right? Because even if we had perfect sampling, we could somehow sample from the entire global population today. That doesn't mean that our results will represent what might happen 15 years from now if we were able to do the same study, right? Because human attitudes and cultural norms can change with time. And so just once again, something I've shown previously in this class, and I like to show in most of my classes, is that in psychology, my field, the field of many of you students, we're focused on the individual, but we need to recognize and consider the fact that there are all these other systems at play that affect the individual. Historical and cultural factors, right, that will affect the individual today and throughout their lives, and environmental factors, both very close to the individual and very far, that will affect how that person goes about their life. Yeah, so like I said, some issues with the way we've used normal in psychology. Um, I hope this shared some new information with you, shed some light on the issue, and we'll see you in the next one.